He was simply working in his vineyard when he stumbled upon a strange iron hatch buried in the ground. No one could explain how it got there. But when the hatch was opened and they descended inside, it became clear. This discovery was hiding a secret that had lain beneath the earth for centuries. Subscribe and write in the comments which city or country you're watching this video from. The land lay where the low hills softened into a long, uneven slope, facing a wind that never quite rested. From a distance, it looked unremarkable. A stretch of earth neither rich nor barren enough to draw attention, the kind of place travelers passed without slowing and surveyors marked with neutral notes. Yet, up close, the ground told a different story. Stones surfaced where they should not have, pressing through the soil after every hard rain as if the earth itself were pushing something away. The color of the dirt shifted unexpectedly from one row to the next, dark and loamy in one place, pale and dry only a few steps away. Water behaved strangely here, lingering in shallow pockets long after storms had passed while other patches cracked open under the same sun. For more than a century, farmers had come, tried their luck, and left again, each convinced they had simply arrived too late to save what was already flawed. Old county records referred to the tract with a tone of quiet resignation. It was described as marginal, inconsistent, unsuitable for serious cultivation. A few handwritten notes in the margins of yellowed ledgers mentioned sinkholes that never fully formed, unexplained collapses of fence posts, and yields that fluctuated without reason. One entry from the late 19th century described a vineyard planted with optimism and abandoned within 5 seasons, the vines growing strong in places that defied common sense and withering where the soil appeared perfectly sound. No one ever claimed the land was cursed, but no one argued when others quietly avoided it. By the time Eli Morris stood on the slope for the first time, the land had been passed through so many hands that its failures had become part of its reputation. Eli had learned early that reputations, like land, often reflected who had been allowed to speak about them. He did not come to the property with romantic expectations or visions of easy abundance. He came because it was available, because it was affordable when nothing else was, and because years of work in other people's fields had taught him that difficulty was not the same as impossibility. Eli's childhood had been shaped by movement and labor. His parents followed seasonal work, moving between regions as crops ripened and harvest demanded hands. He learned the language of soil before he learned the language of permanence, understood the feel of healthy earth and exhausted ground long before he understood contracts or ownership. Fields were never his. They were borrowed spaces where effort was exchanged for wages and then left behind. Even as a boy, he noticed patterns others ignored, how certain slopes held warmth longer into the evening, how roots followed hidden paths of moisture. Those observations stayed with him long after the fields changed and the faces of landowners blurred together. As he grew older, Eli tried to settle, but stability proved elusive. Loans were denied with polite explanations, applications delayed until opportunities disappeared. When he finally saved enough to consider buying land outright, the options offered to him were limited to what others had already dismissed. The slope with the restless wind and stubborn stones appeared again and again in listings, its price dropping steadily as interest faded. By the time Eli visited it, the land seemed resigned to rejection, quiet and unmoving under the afternoon sun. Standing there, Eli felt neither hope nor dread, only a cautious curiosity. He walked the rows where vines might one day grow, pressed his boot into the soil, and knelt to run it through his fingers. The earth was cool beneath the surface, holding moisture in a way that surprised him. He noticed how the slope curved almost imperceptibly inward, how runoff would collect and slow rather than rush away. The stones scattered across the ground were rounded, worn, smooth, not jagged as they would have been if they belonged there naturally. It suggested movement, displacement, something beneath that shaped what lay above. He bought the land not because he believed it was secretly fertile, but because he believed he could learn it. The first years tested that belief. Vines planted according to conventional wisdom struggled in some areas and thrived inexplicably in others. Harvests were uneven, forcing Eli to adjust constantly, to replant, to observe, to wait. Neighbors watched with a mixture of skepticism and mild curiosity, expecting him to give up as others had. Eli did not. The tractor advanced, the earth parted, and the field absorbed the rhythm of another season beginning. It happened without warning. There was no gradual resistance, no subtle change in texture or sound. One moment the tractor moved smoothly, and the next it lurched violently to the left as if struck from below. The jolt threw Eli forward against the wheel, the engine choking as the machine came to an abrupt halt. The suddenness of it stole his breath, replacing the steady hum of work with an unsettling silence broken only by the ticking of hot metal cooling. Eli sat still for a moment, hands gripping the wheel, his pulse quickening as he assessed the sensation. This was not the familiar protest of a buried stone or stubborn root. He had hit those countless times before, and they announced themselves differently, with scraping sounds and gradual resistance. What stopped him now had been immovable, solid in a way that felt deliberate rather than natural. He shut off the engine and climbed down carefully, boots sinking slightly into the disturbed soil. The ground beneath the left wheel had collapsed inward, creating a shallow depression where earth had given way under pressure. Eli crouched beside it, brushing loose dirt aside with his gloved hands. Beneath the soil, something dark and unyielding caught the light. He scraped more carefully now, uncovering a smooth surface that curved away from his touch. At first, he assumed it was a large stone, perhaps an unusually shaped boulder that erosion had hidden until now. But the texture under his fingers told a different story. It was too uniform, too refined. Dirt slid away to reveal metal, dulled by time and corrosion but unmistakable in its purpose. Eli froze, his hand resting against the cold surface as understanding began to form. He reached for the shovel resting against the tractor and began to dig in earnest, widening the exposed area with controlled movements. Soil fell away in clumps, revealing more of the object's arc. The curve extended beyond the reach of the shovel, continuing in both directions beneath the field. Eli worked slowly, conscious now of the possibility that careless force could damage something significant. The deeper he cleared, the clearer it became that this was not debris left behind by recent generations. The metal bore the marks of age, its surface pitted and scarred in ways that suggested decades, if not centuries, beneath the ground. As the morning progressed, the sun climbed higher, casting sharper light across the excavation. Eli wiped sweat from his brow and stepped back to take in what he had uncovered. A section of a circular metal structure lay exposed, its edge disappearing beneath the surrounding soil. The depression beneath the tractor wheel had grown slightly, as if the ground itself acknowledged the removal of pressure that had held it in place. He tried to move the tractor, easing it gently backward to relieve the strain on the compromised earth. The machine resisted, its weight anchored by the uneven ground. Eli did not push it further. The last thing he wanted was to collapse more soil or worsen whatever instability lay below. Instead, he shut down the engine completely and focused on understanding what he had found. The object was embedded within a ring of stone that became visible as he dug further. Unlike the scattered rocks elsewhere in the field, these stones were fitted together with care, their edges smoothed and aligned. They formed a boundary, a deliberate frame for the metal above it. Eli felt a tightening in his chest, not fear exactly, but a deep awareness that he had crossed into something beyond routine discovery. He sat on the overturned bucket he used for carrying tools, staring at the exposed section of metal. The land he thought he knew had revealed a fragment of something hidden, something that challenged every assumption he had made about the field. Memories surfaced of the oddities he had cataloged over the years, the uneven growth, the subtle movements of soil after rain. They rearranged themselves in his mind, forming a pattern that now pointed downward rather than outward. Eli considered his options carefully. He could continue digging, satisfy his curiosity, push deeper until the shape of the object was fully revealed, but instinct held him back. This was not scrap, not a forgotten piece of equipment or abandoned waste. Whatever lay beneath his vineyard had been placed there intentionally, and uncovering it demanded more than personal interest. He marked the area with stakes and bright tape, creating a visible boundary around the depression. Then, he covered the exposed metal with a tarp, securing it against the wind. The act felt ceremonial, a gesture of respect toward something that had waited patiently beneath the soil long before he arrived. Only after the site was protected did he return to the tractor, call for assistance to stabilize it, and make the necessary arrangements to report the find. As the day wore on, Eli watched the field from a distance. The vines stood quietly, their leaves rustling in the same steady wind that had greeted the morning. Nothing about the landscape suggested the significance of what lay beneath, and yet everything seemed subtly altered by its revelation. The land no longer felt merely complex or challenging. It felt layered, as though time itself had folded beneath his feet. By evening, officials had been notified, and Eli had done everything within his power to ensure the site remained undisturbed. He walked the perimeter once more as the light faded, his thoughts returning to the moment of impact, the instant when routine had given way to discovery. The tractor sat idle, its role in the day's events complete, an accidental instrument that had breached a boundary meant to remain hidden. As darkness settled over the vineyard, Eli understood that his relationship with the land had changed irrevocably. The next steps would involve others, specialists and authorities, but the discovery itself belonged to the quiet collision between steel and soil. Beneath the rows of vines, something vast waited, no longer entirely concealed, ready to force the past into the present, whether the land was prepared for it or not. The field did not sleep that night, though it looked as quiet as it always had. The wind moved across the slope with the same patient persistence, brushing the leaves and carrying the scent of turned earth, but the ground itself seemed altered by what had been exposed. Eli Morris lay awake longer than usual, his thoughts circling the image of metal emerging from soil, the unmistakable curve that had resisted his tractor without yielding or breaking. He had replayed the moment again and again, not with excitement, but with the careful attention he gave to anything that demanded responsibility. By dawn, he understood that whatever lay beneath his vineyard was no longer only his concern. Morning brought movement to the land that felt foreign. Vehicles arrived slowly at first, their tires following the narrow access road Eli had carved over the years. Representatives from the county came. Then, specialists summoned by phone calls that had grown increasingly serious as details were relayed. Eli watched from a distance as people gathered near the marked area, their posture and expressions shifting once they saw the exposed metal with their own eyes. What had begun as a private discovery was now unfolding into something that required explanation. The tarp was removed carefully, folded back to reveal the surface beneath. In daylight, the object looked even more deliberate than it had the day before. Rust clung to it unevenly, dark in some places, lighter in others, tracing the subtle imperfections left by time. The metal was thick, far thicker than any modern agricultural fixture, and its curve suggested a complete circle rather than a fragment. Dirt was brushed away with soft tools, revealing lines of rivets set at regular intervals, each one flattened by hand rather than machine. The marks of craftsmanship were unmistakable. As more of the surrounding soil was cleared, the stonework beneath became visible. The stones formed a precise ring, their edges fitted together so tightly that the seams between them were barely visible. This was not the haphazard foundation of a forgotten shed or cellar. It was architecture, built with intention and foresight. The stones bore faint tool marks, shallow grooves left by chisels wielded long before modern equipment existed. Those who examined them exchanged glances that needed no words. Eli stood just beyond the immediate perimeter, answering questions when asked, but mostly observing. He noticed how the expert's movements slowed as understanding took hold, how curiosity gave way to caution. Measurements were taken, notes recorded, photographs captured from every angle. The object was no longer simply metal embedded in earth. It was an entrance. When the full outline of the hatch was finally revealed, its scale became undeniable. The circular metal slab measured several feet across, its surface slightly domed rather than flat. At its center, a faint raised shape emerged, the remnant of a handle or locking mechanism long sealed by corrosion. Around the edges, the metal met stone with a precision that suggested the two had been designed together, not added at different times. The hatch sat at the apex of the stone ring, exactly centered, as if placed there by someone who understood balance and pressure in ways that transcended guesswork. Symbols emerged as the soil was brushed away from the metal surface. They were shallow, worn, nearly smooth, but still visible when the light struck them at the right angle. They did not resemble modern letters or numerals, nor did they match the markings of any industrial manufacturer. Instead, they formed patterns that hinted at authority and ownership, marks intended to communicate meaning to those who knew how to read them. Eli felt a quiet awe at the thought that these symbols had been carved with purpose, not decoration, and that their message had waited centuries to be seen again. The decision to proceed carefully was unanimous. Before any attempt to open the hatch could be made, the space beneath had to be understood. Ground-penetrating radar equipment was brought in, its slow passes across the field revealing what lay hidden beyond the reach of sight. Eli watched the screens as technicians worked, the abstract lines resolving into something unmistakable. Beneath the hatch, a vast, hollow space stretched outward, symmetrical and contained, its boundaries clean and intentional. The void extended farther than anyone had expected, reaching beneath rows of vines that Eli had tended for years without knowing what supported them from below. The images suggested a chamber of considerable size, and its shape consistent, its walls intact. There were no signs of collapse, no irregular voids that would indicate natural formation. This was not a cave carved by water or time. It was a constructed space, preserved by the very earth that had hidden it. The realization settled over the group with quiet gravity. Whatever this structure was, it had survived centuries beneath the vineyard without shifting or failing. Eli felt the weight of that survival keenly. The odd behaviors of the soil, the subtle movements and inconsistencies, began to make sense in a way that left him both unsettled and vindicated. The land had not been unpredictable. It had been responding to what lay beneath it, shaped by the presence of stone and metal designed to endure. Engineers assessed the stability of the area around the hatch, reinforcing the exposed ground and installing supports to prevent accidental collapse. Ropes and barriers were set up, creating a controlled environment that contrasted sharply with the open simplicity of the vineyard beyond. The field had been transformed into a site of investigation, its quiet rhythms interrupted by methodical preparation. As attention focused on the hatch itself, attempts were made to understand how it had been sealed. The central mechanism was examined closely, revealing traces of what might once have been a locking system, now fused shut by rust and mineral deposits. The hatch had not been designed for frequent opening. It was meant to be closed, protected from intrusion, and preserved against time. The realization that it had succeeded for so long only heightened the sense of responsibility surrounding its discovery. When the time came to consider opening it, the mood shifted perceptibly. This was no longer a question of curiosity, but of consequence. The air beneath the hatch had been trapped for generations, its composition unknown. Pressure differentials, potential gases, structural risks, all had to be accounted for. Specialists conferred, plans were drawn, and equipment prepared to manage whatever conditions awaited below. Eli listened as procedures were explained, his role reduced to that of witness rather than participant. He did not resent this. From the moment the tractor wheel had struck metal, he had understood that the discovery belonged to something larger than himself. Still, he felt a quiet sense of connection to the hatch, a recognition that his years of work in the land had led him, inevitably, to this point. The hatch was cleared completely by late afternoon, its full circumference visible, framed by stone and soil held carefully at bay. The metal surface bore the scars of time with dignity, its rusted exterior a testament to endurance rather than decay. As shadows lengthened across the field, the hatch seemed to absorb the fading light, its presence undeniable. That evening, Eli walked the vineyard's edge while preparations continued behind him. The vines swayed gently, unaware of the transformation beneath them. He thought of the countless seasons that had passed over this hidden structure, of storms and droughts, of generations who had worked the land without knowing what lay below. The hatch had waited patiently, sealed and silent, until chance and persistence aligned to reveal it. As night fell, lights were set up around the site, illuminating the hatch with a steady glow that pierced the darkness. It stood at the center of attention now, no longer concealed, its purpose poised to be revealed. Eli understood that the next step would carry them beyond speculation and into certainty. Whatever lay beneath the iron hatch had been hidden with intent, and opening it would draw the past upward into the present, reshaping the land's story forever. The night illumination cast a pale, unwavering glow over the iron hatch, turning the surrounding soil into a quiet amphitheater of shadow and light. By morning, the vineyard no longer felt like a place of growth, but a threshold. Eli Morris returned at dawn to find the field awake with preparation. The calm efficiency of the teams at work carried an unspoken understanding that the next step would be irreversible. The hatch had been exposed, documented, and stabilized. Now it demanded passage. Before anything was touched, the ground around the opening was reinforced. Steel plates were laid to distribute weight, and adjustable supports were sunk into the earth to ensure the stone ring would not shift. The care taken felt almost ceremonial, a recognition that the structure beneath had survived precisely because it had been respected by time and concealment. Instruments were lowered into small test apertures drilled through the hatch's seal to sample the air below. Each reading returned slowly, numbers confirming what theory suggested but could not guarantee. The atmosphere beneath was dry, low in oxygen, and remarkably stable, as if the space had been waiting in suspension. Eli stood near the boundary, his presence both necessary and peripheral. He had become accustomed to this position over the past days, close enough to feel responsible, distant enough to know when restraint mattered more than ownership. The quiet of the morning was punctuated by the measured sounds of preparation, the soft whine of motors, the scrape of metal against metal, the murmur of focused voices. Nothing was rushed. The hatch had waited centuries. It could wait a little longer. When the decision to open it was finally made, it unfolded without spectacle. A winch system was anchored to reinforced points around the stone ring, its cables attached to the hatch with clamps designed to distribute force evenly. As tension increased, the metal responded with a low, resistant groan, a sound that seemed to rise from deep within the ground rather than from the hatch itself. Rust flaked away in small showers, falling into the narrow seam as the seal began to break. The hatch did not lift easily. It resisted with the stubbornness of something that had grown comfortable in stillness. Gradually, with steady pressure, it yielded. The seal parted, releasing a slow, deliberate exhale of air that drifted upward and dissipated into the morning light. It carried no rot, no sharpness, only the scent of stone and age, a dryness that spoke of enclosure rather than decay. Once the opening was wide enough, lights were lowered into the space below. Their beams descended into darkness, swallowed at first by depth, then reflected faintly by stone surfaces far beneath. The space revealed itself reluctantly, its scale emerging piece by piece as illumination reached further down. The opening led into a vertical shaft lined with stone blocks fitted so precisely they appeared almost seamless. The walls bore the marks of careful construction, their surfaces smoothed and shaped to guide rather than resist descent. The first person to enter did so with deliberate caution. Harnessed and secured, they lowered themselves slowly, testing each meter as the rope unspooled. Eli watched the descent with an intensity that surprised him. This was not curiosity alone. It was the recognition that the land he had worked for years was opening itself, exposing a depth that redefined its meaning. As the descent continued, the shaft widened subtly, its walls curving outward. The architecture suggested forethought, an understanding of pressure and movement that ensured stability over time. No debris littered the passage. No evidence of collapse or intrusion marred the stone. Everything spoke of permanence, of a structure designed to endure without maintenance, hidden but not forgotten by those who built it. When the rope reached the bottom, the light revealed a floor far below, smooth and level, its surface catching the beam in a way that suggested deliberate finishing. The signal from below came swiftly, measured and unmistakable. The space was intact. More lights followed, illuminating the chamber in stages. As the darkness retreated, the scale of the space became clear. The shaft opened into a vast hall, its ceiling supported by graceful stone arches that rose higher than anyone had expected. The symmetry of the design was striking. Every curve, every line mirrored itself across the central axis, creating a sense of balance that felt almost serene. This was not a place built in haste or fear. It was built with confidence, perhaps even pride. Eli felt a shift within himself as the chamber emerged from shadow. The odd behaviors of the field above, the way water lingered and warmth persisted, suddenly aligned with the presence of this space. The stone beneath had shaped the land as much as the land had concealed the stone. Roots and soil had adapted to the architecture below, forming an unspoken partnership across centuries. Careful steps followed. A platform was lowered to allow additional personnel to descend safely. With each movement, the chamber revealed more of itself. The walls bore no decorative carvings, no indulgent ornamentation. Instead, they displayed a restrained elegance, stone-fitted stone with a precision that left little room for interpretation. This was a functional space, but one built with an understanding that function need not exclude beauty. The air within the chamber was cool and dry, preserved by isolation. Sound behaved differently here, carried softly and evenly, as if absorbed by the stone rather than reflected. Footsteps echoed faintly, then settled into silence. The absence of decay was striking. No mold crept along the walls, no water stains marked the ceiling. The chamber had been sealed at the right moment, protected from the elements by the very earth that hid it. As the lights expanded outward, shapes began to resolve along the perimeter of the hall. Rectangular forms stood in orderly rows, their outlines heavy and deliberate. Even before details became clear, their purpose suggested itself. These were not random objects left behind. They were placed. Eli descended part way, stopping at a point where the shaft met the chamber's upper boundary. He did not need to go further to feel the weight of what lay below. The space radiated intention, the quiet authority of something meant to hold value, to remain undisturbed until claimed by those who understood its purpose. The realization settled slowly but firmly. This was not a forgotten cellar or an abandoned refuge. It was a repository, sealed with care and foresight, its existence erased from memory not by accident, but by time's selective mercy. The people who built it had trusted that stone and earth would keep their secret longer than words or records ever could. As the descent concluded and the chamber stood fully illuminated, those above exchanged looks that reflected both awe and restraint. The opening of the hatch had not unleashed chaos or ruin. It had revealed preservation. The structure beneath the vineyard had waited patiently, and now, exposed to light once more, it demanded understanding rather than haste. Eli looked back up the shaft toward the circle of daylight above. The vineyard lay beyond that opening, its vines rooted in soil shaped by centuries of hidden architecture. The descent beneath the field had not separated him from the land he knew. It had connected him to it more deeply than he had ever imagined. The next step would move beyond structure and space into purpose and history. But for now, the chamber itself stood as proof that the past had not merely survived beneath his field. It had endured intact, waiting to be recognized. The chamber revealed itself fully only after the last lights were positioned and the initial stillness gave way to careful movement. What had first appeared as a vast, empty volume of stone now resolved into an ordered space whose purpose became clearer with every step taken across its floor. The architecture did not overwhelm by ornament or scale alone, but by discipline. Every line obeyed a logic that spoke of planning measured not in days or years, but in generations. The arches rose in balanced intervals, distributing weight with such precision that the ceiling showed no sign of strain, despite the centuries it had borne the earth above. The stone blocks were uniform in size, their joints so tight that even now, after countless seasons of pressure and change, no visible gaps had formed between them. The floor was laid with large rectangular slabs, smoothed and fitted to create a surface that felt deliberate underfoot. There was no debris, no accumulation of sediment, no trace of intrusion. It was as though the chamber had been sealed moments after its last use, preserved in a state of suspended intention. The air carried a dryness that reinforced this impression, a controlled environment that had resisted time rather than surrendered to it. Even sound seemed subdued, footsteps softened by stone that absorbed rather than reflected. Along the perimeter of the hall stood the objects that had first appeared as indistinct shapes from above. As the lights reached them fully, their nature became unmistakable. Massive chests lined the walls in orderly rows, each one resting on low stone plinths that lifted them just enough to protect them from any moisture that might have entered before the chamber was sealed. They were constructed of heavy timber bound with iron bands, their surfaces darkened not by rot, but by age and the slow chemical conversation between wood, metal, and air over centuries. The ironwork was elaborate without being decorative. Hinges were thick and reinforced, locks complex and reinforced with additional plates, as if the builders had anticipated not only the value of what lay within, but the possibility that time itself might become an adversary. Many of the chests bore marks pressed into the metal bands, heraldic symbols worn smooth by oxidation yet still recognizable in their form. Crowns, shields, stylized animals, and geometric emblems repeated in variations, suggesting authority centralized but expressed through multiple regions or offices. As the nearest chest was examined, it became clear that none had been disturbed. Locks were intact, their mechanisms fused by corrosion but unbroken. Wax seals, hardened and darkened, still clung to recessed areas near the closures, bearing the faint impressions of stamps applied by hands long gone. These seals were not symbolic alone. They were legal instruments, markers of accountability and control. Whoever had sealed these chests had expected them to be opened again under official authority, not forgotten beneath soil and vines. When one chest was finally opened under controlled conditions, its contents confirmed what architecture and restraint had already implied. Inside lay stacks of silver coins arranged in careful layers, separated by thin wooden dividers. The coins varied in size and origin, bearing inscriptions and iconography from different mints, yet all shared a consistent level of purity and weight. This was not random wealth accumulated through chance or theft. It was systematic, regulated, collected according to rules enforced across distance and time. Further examination revealed gold coins as well, fewer in number but unmistakable in significance. They were set apart from the silver, wrapped in cloth that had long since lost its color but retained its weave. Some pieces showed minimal wear, suggesting they had passed through the few hands before being stored here. Others bore the softened edges of circulation, evidence of trade, taxation, and obligation converging in this single place beneath the field. Beyond the coins lay objects of a different nature. Church vessels fashioned from precious metals rested in padded compartments, their surfaces etched with religious symbols and inscriptions. Chalices, patens, and reliquaries reflected the light with a muted glow, their presence a reminder that taxation in the medieval world did not respect boundaries between sacred and secular. The church had been both collector and contributor, its wealth flowing alongside that of landowners, merchants, and towns. In one section of the hall, separate from the chest, stone shelves supported bundles of parchment sealed within protective wrappings. These documents, though fragile, had survived remarkably well in the dry environment. When unwrapped and examined, they revealed meticulous records written in firm, practiced hands. Names, dates, locations, quantities, all recorded with precision. Routes taken by tax collectors were traced in ink, noting villages visited, obligations fulfilled, and amounts secured. Marginal notes hinted at delays, disputes, and exemptions granted under specific circumstances. What emerged from these records was a portrait of an administrative system operating with impressive reach. Taxes had been gathered not haphazardly, but through a network of officials accountable to a central authority. The chamber beneath the vineyard had served as a terminal point, a secure repository where wealth flowed inward and waited to be transferred onward. Its location, hidden yet accessible, suggested strategic planning. It lay far enough from population centers to avoid attention, yet close enough to established routes to allow efficient transport. As the scale of the accumulation became apparent, so too did the scope of its abandonment. The volume of wealth stored here represented years of collection, perhaps decades. It was not a temporary cache, but a long-term holding intended to support something significant. The absence of any sign that it had ever been retrieved raised questions that echoed through the hall more loudly than any spoken speculation. Eli observed these discoveries with a growing sense of displacement. The vineyard above suddenly felt thin, like a surface stretched over something far older and heavier than his own history. He had measured success in seasons and yields, in years of persistence rewarded by gradual improvement. Beneath his feet lay evidence of time measured differently, in reigns and administrations, in structures built to outlast the people who ordered their construction. The chamber's organization reinforced this sense of authority frozen in place. Nothing had been left to chance. The placement of each chest, the alignment of shelves, the spacing between structural supports all spoke of a mind that valued order as a form of power. Even now, centuries after its creators had vanished from memory, that order imposed itself on those who entered. It demanded careful movement, quiet observation, and respect. As attention moved from one section of the hall to another, patterns emerged in the contents. Certain symbols appeared repeatedly, linking chests to specific regions or offices. Variations in coinage reflected shifting economic conditions, debasements, reforms, and recoveries. The documents recorded not only what had been collected, but when and from whom, providing a detailed snapshot of a medieval economy in motion. Yet there was an abruptness to the records. The final entries ended without conclusion, their last lines unaccompanied by the closing annotations that marked completion or transfer. There were no notes of retrieval, no records of dispatch. The system had stopped, not gradually, but decisively. Whatever had been intended to follow this accumulation never occurred. Standing in the hall, Eli felt the weight of that interruption. The chamber was not a monument to success, but to interruption, a place where purpose had been suspended and then erased by time. The land above had continued its cycles, ignorant of the frozen moment below, adapting and reshaping itself around a void of unfulfilled intention. As the day wore on, the understanding settled that this was no ordinary discovery. The hall beneath the vineyard was not merely a cache of wealth, but the preserved core of an abandoned system of power. It represented authority that had extended its reach here, gathered resources, and then failed to return. The reasons for that failure lay beyond the stone walls, embedded in history yet to be fully understood. When Eli finally looked back toward the shaft leading upward, he felt the distance between the hall and the vineyard not just as depth, but as separation between eras. Above, vines grew and seasons turned. Below, silver and gold rested where they had been placed, waiting not for retrieval, but for explanation. The Hall of Royal Levies had revealed its contents, but not yet its story, and the silence that followed felt less like emptiness than anticipation. Understanding followed discovery at a slower pace, as it always did. The hall beneath the vineyard had revealed what it contained, but not why it had been left untouched. That question lingered in the chamber like a pressure change, subtle yet impossible to ignore. The wealth, the order, the precision of the records all argued against accident. Nothing about the hall suggested panic or flight. It spoke, instead of interruption, of a process halted not by chaos within the chamber, but by forces that had unfolded elsewhere, far beyond the reach of its stone walls. As scholars began to piece together the evidence, the chamber transformed from a silent repository into a crossroads of history. The symbols pressed into iron bands and wax seals were compared against archives, their shapes traced through manuscripts and fragmented records preserved in distant collections. Gradually, identities emerged. The emblems belonged to a short-lived medieval kingdom whose borders had once stretched across fertile valleys and contested passes, a realm ambitious in its administration but fragile in its foundations. It had existed in a time when authority depended as much on movement as decree, when a ruler's presence was required to turn taxation into power. The documents told a consistent story. Levies had been collected methodically from towns, abbeys, and estates across the region. The routes described followed ancient roads, some now vanished, others still faintly visible in the landscape. The collector's notes reflected confidence. Payments were recorded as fulfilled obligations, not emergency measures. This was taxation for consolidation, not survival. The wealth was being gathered in anticipation of something yet to come. Historical context filled in what the chamber itself could not say. The period had been one of uneasy stability, bracketed by long wars and sudden plagues. The king, for whom these levies were gathered, had inherited a fractured territory and sought to bind it through centralized authority. He planned a formal progress through the outer regions of his realm, a ceremonial journey meant to assert control, dispense justice, and secure loyalty. The chamber beneath the vineyard had been prepared as part of that effort, a secure point where collected wealth would be held until his arrival, then redistributed according to royal will. But the king never came. Records beyond the chamber spoke of shifting alliances and distant conflict. As preparations continued in the borderlands, events elsewhere unraveled faster than messengers could travel. A war ignited on the opposite frontier, drawing resources and attention inward. Soon after, illness spread through court and countryside alike, striking indiscriminately and eroding the fragile administrative structure that supported the crown. Within a few years, the king was dead, his heirs contested, and the realm divided among rival claimants. In that turmoil, priorities changed. Routes once maintained for royal travel became dangerous or impassable. Officials responsible for the chamber were recalled, killed, or absorbed into new administrations. The records ceased not because they were finished, but because there was no longer an authority capable of completing the process they documented. The hall beneath the vineyard slipped from relevance into obscurity, its existence known only to those who no longer had the power or reason to retrieve its contents. The final entries in the documents reflected this uncertainty. dates appeared without annotations of completion. Notes mentioned delays attributed to unrest along certain roads, to weather that made passage difficult. Then the handwriting stopped. There was no closing statement, no seal marking the end of a fiscal cycle. The system had not concluded. It had simply been abandoned. As historians reconstructed this sequence, the silence of the chamber took on new meaning. The hall was not a forgotten treasure, but a fossilized intention. It represented a moment when power had reached outward, gathered resources, and then collapsed before it could reclaim them. The gold and silver were not lost through negligence, but stranded by history's sudden redirection. This understanding extended beyond political narratives into the physical reality of the land itself. The chamber's presence explained the vineyard's peculiar behavior in ways that now felt almost obvious. The massive stone structure acted as a stabilizing core beneath the soil, altering drainage patterns and thermal retention. Water filtered differently through layers interrupted by masonry. Heat absorbed by stone during the day radiated upward at night, protecting roots from frost. The land had been shaped quietly and persistently by what lay beneath, responding over centuries to architecture designed for permanence rather than agriculture. Eli absorbed these explanations with a mixture of clarity and humility. The land's challenges had never been random. They were the surface expression of a deeper order imposed long before his time. His success, modest as it felt to him, had come not from conquering the field, but from adapting to its hidden structure. He had learned to work with effects whose cause he could not see, guided by observation rather than assumption. Now the cause stood illuminated, and the lesson felt both validating and sobering. The story of the chamber reframed the vineyard's history as well. What had been dismissed as marginal land was, in fact, land shaped by deliberate human intervention centuries earlier. The slope had been chosen not for its fertility but for its concealment and accessibility. The builders had understood the terrain, selecting a location that balanced isolation with logistical practicality. When their world collapsed, the land absorbed their work and carried it forward silently, transforming royal infrastructure into an agricultural anomaly. As word of the discovery spread, interest grew not only in the wealth itself, but in what it revealed about the region's past. Scholars debated how many similar structures might once have existed, lost to memory and erosion. The chamber beneath Eli's vineyard became a reference point, a rare, intact example of administrative ambition interrupted by catastrophe. It offered insight into how medieval power extended itself into rural landscapes, and how quickly that power could vanish, leaving behind only stone and metal as evidence. For Eli, this broader narrative deepened his sense of connection to the land without altering his place within it. He was not the heir to the wealth below, nor its custodian in any formal sense. He was a witness, someone whose life intersected with history at a point of long-delayed revelation. The vineyard above continued its cycles, now understood as the latest layer in a sequence far older than any single human endeavor. Standing at the edge of the excavation one evening, Eli looked across the rows of vines toward the horizon where hills softened into distance. He thought of the people who had built the chamber, of their confidence in systems that felt permanent at the time. They had trusted stone, order, and authority to endure. Instead, it was the land itself that endured, absorbing their work and carrying it forward until chance and persistence brought it back into the light. The history that never arrived had shaped everything nonetheless. The king's absence, the halted journey, the abandoned levees, had left a mark more lasting than any completed decree. Beneath the vineyard, history waited not as a lesson fully told, but as a reminder that power could stall, systems could fail, and yet the world would continue above them, roots growing, seasons turning, and lives unfolding unaware of the weight they carried underfoot. Once the history of the chamber had taken shape, the consequences followed with a quiet inevitability. The discovery beneath the vineyard could no longer exist as a secret shared among specialists and stone walls. It entered a different phase, one governed not by curiosity or interpretation, but by law, responsibility, and public memory. The land that Eli Morris had worked in relative anonymity was now bound to something far larger than his own labor, and the transition altered the meaning of ownership in ways he had never anticipated. Official designations came first. The chamber was declared a protected archaeological site, its boundaries extending upward through layers of soil into the field itself. Maps were redrawn, lines traced not by fences but by coordinates and legal language. What had once been a continuous vineyard became a landscape of zones, some accessible, some restricted, all subject to oversight. Eli followed these developments with careful attention, not out of resistance, but out of necessity. The land was still his livelihood, even as it was transformed into an object of national interest. Compensation was arranged with a thoroughness that reflected the significance of the find. Financial assessments considered not only the value of the discovery, but the disruption to Eli's work, the loss of use in certain areas, and the long-term implications for his farming operations. The sums discussed exceeded anything he had ever imagined in relation to the vineyard, yet they arrived without triumph. Money, in this context, felt abstract, a tool to balance equations rather than a reward. Eli accepted it with the same pragmatism he applied to all practical matters, understanding that it was meant to stabilize rather than enrich. What changed more noticeably was the way others regarded him. People who had once dismissed the vineyard as an odd choice now spoke of it with reverence. Eli's role in the discovery was acknowledged repeatedly, though always framed as accidental. He did not argue with that characterization. He knew how close he had come to passing over the moment, how easily the tractor might have missed the hatch by a matter of inches. Still, he felt a quiet conviction that persistence had played its part. Years of refusing to abandon the land had placed him in the right position at the right time, even if the time in itself belonged to chance. The vineyard adapted just as Eli did. Work resumed around the protected zone, adjusted rather than halted. Rows were replanted with careful consideration of the boundaries below. Machinery moved with deliberate precision, guided by updated maps that marked where stone replaced soil at depth. The rhythms of farming returned, altered but intact. Grapes continued to ripen, harvests continued to come, and the land responded with the same subtle complexity it always had. Eli found that his understanding of the field had deepened rather than diminished. Where once he had read signs without knowing their source, he now worked with a clearer sense of cause and effect. The stone beneath influenced water, heat, and structure. The vineyard was no longer simply land shaped by natural forces, but by human intention layered beneath nature's patience. This knowledge did not make the work easier, but it made it more coherent, as though the land's behavior had finally explained itself. Visitors arrived with increasing frequency, drawn not by wine or agriculture, but by history. Scholars, officials, journalists, and curious observers passed through the edges of the property, guided along designated paths that skirted the excavation. Eli watched them from a distance, recognizing the difference between their engagement and his own. For them, the chamber was an object of study, a narrative to be assembled. For him, it was a presence woven into the daily reality of his work. He did not feel possessive of it, but he felt responsible for the space where it surfaced. The shift in status brought moments of discomfort. Attention, even respectful attention, carried a weight Eli was unaccustomed to bearing. He preferred the anonymity of routine, the quiet exchange between effort and result. Yet he also understood that the discovery had lifted the vineyard out of obscurity in a way that could not be reversed. The land now existed in two registers at once, as a working farm and as a preserved fragment of history. This duality required negotiation, both external and internal. Eli learned to speak in measured terms about the discovery, offering facts without embellishment. He resisted attempts to frame the story as fortune or destiny. To him, it remained a matter of continuity rather than transformation. The vineyard had always been shaped by what lay beneath. The only difference now was awareness. In quieter moments, Eli reflected on how little his relationship with the land had actually changed. He still rose early, still walked the rows, still responded to weather and season with the same attentiveness he always had. The chamber beneath did not demand reverence in his daily work. It demanded care. The same care he had given the field long before its presence was known. Respect, he realized, was not a response to significance, but a condition for recognizing it. The broader impact of the discovery continued to unfold beyond the vineyard's borders. The region gained new historical definition, its past reframed by the evidence uncovered beneath Eli's field. What had once been considered peripheral was now understood as connected, a place where central authority had reached and then receded. The chamber became a reference point in academic discussions, its preservation cited as a rare convergence of circumstance and restraint. Eli listened to these developments with interest, but without a sense of ownership over the narrative. He understood that history, once uncovered, belonged to those who studied it as much as to those who lived above it. His role was not to interpret the past, but to maintain the present with integrity. The vineyard remained his responsibility, and that responsibility grounded him when abstraction threatened to take over. As seasons passed, the initial intensity surrounding the discovery softened into something steadier. The excavation continued methodically, its progress measured and deliberate. The vineyard settled into a new equilibrium, one that accommodated both agriculture and preservation. Eli found satisfaction in this balance. The land had always demanded adaptation. Now it simply asked for a different kind of attentiveness. In moments of solitude, standing at the edge of the protected zone, Eli felt the weight of layered time more keenly than before. He thought of the people who had built the chamber, of their confidence in systems meant to endure. He thought of how easily those systems had dissolved, leaving their work buried and forgotten. And he thought of his own efforts, modest by comparison, yet rooted in the same desire for continuity. The land beneath Eli's feet no longer belonged solely to him in the simplest sense, but it remained his in the way that mattered most. He knew its moods, its responses, its limits. He worked it with knowledge gained through patience rather than possession. The vineyard and the chamber had become parts of a single story, one shaped by interruption and endurance alike. As the vineyard entered another cycle of growth, Eli recognized that his role had subtly shifted. He was no longer just a farmer adapting to difficult land. He had become a caretaker of a place where past and present intersected, where history did not remain abstract but pressed upward into daily life. The realization did not burden him. It steadied him, anchoring his work in a context far deeper than he had ever expected. The land had revealed itself, not as a source of sudden wealth or transformation, but as a testament to continuity across centuries. Eli accepted that testament with the same quiet resolve that had guided him from the beginning, knowing that his work would one day become another layer, resting above stone and memory, waiting for whatever future chance or persistence might uncover next. Time resumed its ordinary shape once the immediate consequences of discovery settled into routine. The vineyard entered another season, not with ceremony, but with the quiet insistence that had always governed it. Buds swelled, leaves unfurled, and the rows reclaimed their familiar geometry. From a distance, nothing marked the land as extraordinary. The protected zone lay unobtrusive beneath a modest boundary, its presence acknowledged without spectacle. Above it, the vines continued their work, drawing nourishment from soil that had learned long ago how to accommodate stone. Eli Morris returned to the rhythms that had shaped his days for decades. He rose early, before the light softened the hills, and walked the rows with the same attentiveness he had always practiced. The work felt neither heavier nor lighter for what lay beneath. It felt more precise. Each step carried an awareness of depth, of the layered nature of the ground he crossed. Where once he had relied on intuition alone, he now moved with knowledge that confirmed his instincts without replacing them. The tractor returned to the field, its engine a familiar counterpoint to the wind. Eli guided it carefully, following paths adjusted to respect the space below. The machine moved steadily, no longer an accidental instrument of revelation, but a tool returned to its purpose. The soil responded as it always had, firm in some places, yielding in others, shaped by forces both visible and hidden. Eli worked without haste, letting the land set the pace, accepting its constraints as part of its character. There were moments, as the days unfolded, when the presence beneath the vines made itself felt in subtle ways. A warmth lingered in the ground after cool nights, rising gently through the soil to protect tender roots. Moisture behaved predictably now that its cause was understood, pooling and dispersing according to the stone's influence. What had once seemed irregular now appeared coherent, as if the vineyard had been waiting for recognition rather than correction. Visitors still came, though less frequently than before. Their interest had matured from excitement into study, from spectacle into stewardship. Eli greeted them politely when required, guided them along designated paths, and returned to his work once formalities were complete. The vineyard did not need an audience. It needed care. He found comfort in that distinction, and the understanding that his responsibility remained unchanged even as the land's story expanded. As summer deepened, the vines flourished. The grapes developed slowly, their growth measured and resilient. The harvest promised quality rather than abundance, a balance Eli had learned to value. When he tasted the fruit, he recognized the familiar complexity that had first drawn quiet attention to the vineyard years before. The flavor carried the same depth, the same restrained intensity, as if the land itself remembered what it had always offered. In the evenings, Eli often paused at the edge of the protected zone, standing where the vineyard met the unseen boundary below. He did not linger out of reverence, but out of habit, the way one pauses at the end of a row before turning back. The thought that an immense hall lay beneath his feet no longer startled him. It grounded him. The stone and metal below felt less like a secret and more like a foundation, a reminder that the present rested upon layers shaped by intention, failure, and endurance alike. He thought sometimes of the builders who had shaped the chamber, of their confidence in systems meant to outlast them. They had trusted in stone, in order, in authority. When those systems faltered, the land had absorbed their work without judgment, carrying it forward until time and chance allowed it to be seen again. Eli understood, in a way he had not before, that permanence was not guaranteed by design alone. It was granted by what remained useful, adaptable, and capable of being held by the earth itself. The vineyard had taught him that lesson long before the discovery. It had resisted easy solutions, demanded observation, rewarded patience. It had asked him to listen rather than impose, to adjust rather than conquer. Now, knowing what lay beneath, that lesson felt complete. The land had always been layered, its behavior shaped by histories both natural and human. Work in it meant accepting that one never truly stood on a single surface, but on the accumulation of countless decisions made over time. As harvest approached, the routines intensified. Baskets were prepared, equipment checked, schedules set. The work filled Eli's days with purpose that required no reflection. Yet, even in the busiest moments, awareness remained. The vineyard was no longer just a place of labor. It was a conversation across centuries, one conducted without words, through stone and soil, root and structure. When the grapes were finally gathered, the yield met expectations shaped by experience rather than hope. The wine that followed carried the vineyard's signature, unchanged by revelation yet enriched by understanding. Eli did not market it differently, did not attach narratives of discovery to its label. The wine spoke for itself as it always had. Those who appreciated it did so for its quality, not its history, and Eli preferred it that way. Winter returned with its familiar restraint. Frost traced the vines, the ground hardened, and the vineyard entered its season of rest. Beneath the soil, the chamber remained unchanged, sealed and stable, its contents preserved in their long stillness. Above, life slowed, preparing for renewal. Eli welcomed the quiet, finding in it the same balance that had drawn him to the land in the first place. On one such winter morning, he walked the rows alone, the vineyard stripped to its essential lines. The air was cold, the ground firm beneath his boots. He stopped where the tractor had first struck metal months before, the moment now marked only by memory and careful repair. There was no visible trace of upheaval, no scar to suggest what lay below. The land had closed over the event, incorporating it as it had everything else. Eli stood there for a long moment, not searching for meaning, but acknowledging continuity. The past had surfaced and settled again, its presence integrated rather than imposed. The vineyard remained what it had always been, a place shaped by effort, patience, and respect for forces beyond immediate control. The chamber beneath had not changed that truth, it had clarified it. As he turned back toward the house, Eli felt no sense of conclusion, only continuation. The land would outlast him, just as it had outlasted those who built beneath it. His work would become another layer, another quiet influence shaping what came next. Beneath the vines, stone and metal would wait, not for discovery again, but as part of the ground's enduring memory. The vineyard stretched behind him, silent and composed, holding within it the weight of centuries without strain. Life continued above, steady and unremarkable in the best possible way. Beneath the vines, history rested, not as a burden, but as a foundation. If this story kept you watching until the end, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. New stories are coming, and some of them go even deeper than this. Watch the other videos on the channel to uncover more hidden discoveries and forgotten histories. Share this video with someone who loves real mysteries buried beneath everyday places. And write in the comments where you're watching from. Your city or country might appear in a future story.